Hello, I'm Chris Downey, also known as Captain Bird. We'll get to that story in a little bit. So just here today to talk a little bit about writing, how I've started to get into writing, which is an interesting story, and talk about my books, which we have here. There's 3 of them. So I went to Virginia Tech to college. I graduated in 1995 and got a degree in history. Never really used it. As soon as I got out of college, I got into the maritime industry. So I've been doing that for almost 25 years now. And if you ever see the big ship to say MSC on the side, that's me. I'm the director of vessel planning for that company. So I've been working in the maritime industry for a long time. So I'm also a big boater, and I love boats. I've had a boat of one kind or another for as long as I can remember. And so if you're a boat owner, you'll know this, that whenever you have a boat, you always are dreaming of your next bigger boat and what you're going to go to next. And so about 15 years ago, I was in that position, and I had a perfect boat for Charleston. I was perfectly content with what I had, at least for a little while, and then I decided maybe it's time to get a bigger boat with more buttons and whistles and gadgets. And so I started to shop around, but I couldn't really quantify in my mind why to get a bigger boat and spend more money and where that money was going to come from. So I really kind of struggled with it for a while and molded over in my mind of how I'm going to get this bigger boat. And then one night I was literally laying in bed, and it was like one of those things you'd see in a movie, and I sat upright in bed and I said, I've got it. I'll give tours in the boat. I have a degree in history. I love Charleston history. I could take the boat, go out, give people a tour, charge them money, and then that revenue would pay for the extra cost of a bigger boat. So that was my plan. I started to put my plan to action, and so the first thing that I needed to do was to get the licensing. So I went through all the Coast Guard classes and took the test and all those things, and I became Captain Christopher Downey. Now, when I was growing up, everyone called me Bird because my middle name is Bird, B-Y-R-D, which the Birds are kind of a famous name in Virginia, and even my dad called me Bird, and my friends called me Bird, because when I was a kid, there was a boy was named Christopher, and every girl was named Amy. So any way you could differentiate between the different names with a nickname, that's what you did. So I was Bird to everybody. So when I became Captain Christopher Downey, I just kind of naturally turned into Captain Bird, and that's what everyone started calling me. So I decided to name my business Captain Bird's Boat Tours. So I went out, I got my licensing, I bought the big boat, I kind of reconfigured it so I could take passengers, I got all set, and I just needed a place to pick people up and drop them off. So I went to the Maritime Center down on Charleston Harbor, which was the place at the time where you took tours in and out on boats, and I met with the director there, and I said, look, here's my plan, here's my business plan. I had done crossed the T's, dotted the I's, here's what I want to do, I want to give history tours. And he was very nice, and he was like, sure, we can do this. We'll charge you X number of dollars for each drop off and pick up and blah, blah, blah. And I did the math, and I was like, okay, I can still make money even with paying this fee. And so, we had it all settled. Everything was great. And so just as I was getting ready to leave, he said, just one thing, you can't offer any kind of historical tour that competes with any other tours that are now running out of the Maritime Center. And I was like, oh boy, well, what have you got? And he started listing tours. He's like, we got Civil War, we got Revolutionary War, we got Colonial Charleston, we've got ghost tours, we've got this, we've got that. And I was like, wow, that's just about everything. And then it kind of struck me. I said, what about pirates? Do you have a pirate tour? And he stopped and thought for a minute, and he said, you know what, we don't have a pirate tour. And I said, that's it. I'll be Captain Bird's Boat Tours, and I'll offer pirate tours on Charleston Harbor. So I went back home, and then I started to just bury myself in local Charleston pirate history and learned as much as I possibly could about pirates. So I started my tours, started taking people out. They were mostly from Ohio. They thought it was really cool to be in a boat and riding around talking about pirates. And I learned pretty quickly that the most interesting part of my pirate tour was a pirate by the name of Steve Bonnett, who is the subject of my first book there. Steve Bonnett was basically a millionaire plantation owner in Barbados, and for whatever reason, he decided to become a pirate. He fell in with Blackbeard. He was a terrible pirate. He ends up getting captured, brought to Charleston, and hanged in 1718. But he was very much the everyman pirate, and the tourists on my boat seemed to love the story of Steve Bonnett. That was just kind of the best part of the tour. So one day I'm giving a tour, and I meet a lady who is an editor at a local publisher here in Charleston. And after the tour, she said, hey, have you ever thought about writing a book about Stede Bonnet? Because I don't think there's any out there. And I said, no, that sounds like a terrible idea. I would never want to write a book. And she was like, well, look, just write like 2,000 or 3,000 words, send it to me, and if we like it, we'll offer you a contract, and you can write this book. And I thought, wow, that sounds terrible. So I went back home and I decided, okay, I'll do it. I'll just kind of summarize in a couple thousand words what I say on my boat tour, and I'll send it in. So I sent it to her, emailed it to her. I didn't hear anything for like 3 months. So I was like, that must have been really terrible what I wrote, and they're not interested in it. And so one day I come home from work, I go out to the mailbox, and I open the mailbox, and there's a contract for me to write a book about Stede Bonnet called Stede Bonnet, Charleston's Gentleman Pirate. And I thought, wow, I've really like gotten myself into a mess here. And I did it. I just sat down and I started to write a book about Stede Bonnet, and it did really well. And it came out in, I think, 2011. And so they said, hey, the next year they said, look, your book did really well. People really enjoyed that story. What do you think about writing another book? And I said, sure, I think I would, but let's do anything but pirates, because I'm pretty sick of pirates. Between the pirate tours and the book, I've kind of done enough pirates to last me the rest of my life. And they said, okay, well, we'll try to think of some other subjects and we'll get back to you. So a few weeks later, they called back and they said, look, just write one more book about pirates, and then the third one you can write about whatever you want to. And I said, okay, so that's how I came along with Charleston, the Golden Age of Piracy, which tells the Stede Bonnet story, but also tells the story of all the pirate stories in Charleston, from Blackbeard to Anne Bonny, the female pirate. That's a really fun story. Blackjack Rackham, all those things that happened in Charleston. That's how I came about on my second book, Charleston and the Golden Age of Piracy. And then I kind of took a break. I got married. I had a son, and I gave up the boat tours because there's just not time for that once you get married and have kids. And things were quiet for a while. And then the publisher came back and said, look, how about some other ideas? What would you want to do? And we bounced around some ideas. I kind of wanted to do a book about the Cooper River, and maybe do like a little navigation of the Cooper River and talk about the different plantations as they were back in the day versus today. There was a book called A Day on the Cooper that was written back 150 years ago, that was actually a series of letters written into the paper that they turned into a book that did that very thing 150 years ago. And I thought it might be fun to do a story where now 150 years later I compare what the river is like compared to that 150 years ago. But we couldn't make any agreements, and things went quiet again. And then finally, one day we decided on Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe had kind of been mulling around in my mind for a while. I mean, Edgar Allan Poe, I'm from the Richmond area of Virginia, which is where Poe grew up. And so Poe's always been kind of a part of my life. The Poe Museum in Richmond is very popular. You take school field trips there. And I love Halloween. It's always been my favorite holiday. And I've just been a big Poe guy my whole life. And so making a connection to Charleston with Poe sounded like an interesting topic. And the real genesis of that story was when I was working on Stede Bonnet, actually, the Stede Bonnet book. I went to the Charleston Library Society to do some research, and I walked in and I spoke to the librarian. I said, look, I'm doing some research on some local pirates. What do you have? How can you help me out? And pretty quickly that conversation devolved into different subjects, as often will happen when you're studying or researching history. And we started talking about treasure, and that evolved into talking about Edgar Allan Poe, and that evolved into the Gold Bug story, which is Edgar Allan Poe's famous short story about Captain Kidd's buried treasure on Sullivan's Island. And so we kind of went down this rabbit hole about Edgar Allan Poe. And then kind of matter-of-factly, she just said to me, did you know that Edgar Allan Poe stole a poem written into the Charleston paper, written in 1807, 2 years before he was born, and he stole that poem and used it to write Annabel Lee? And I was like, wow, I came in here to talk about pirates, but now I'm going to go down like this crazy history rabbit hole and get lost in this story, and I did for the day. And she brought out a magazine that was called something like the German and English Philological Society magazine from 1922. And a guy had written in this article where he had gone and he'd found a newspaper, the Charleston Courier, from December of 1807, so 2 years before Edgar Allan Poe was born. And it was this poem called The Mourner. And it was a poem that and it was signed by a guy with the initials DMC, not even a name, just initials. And it was a poem written to a woman named Anna, and she had died. And every line ended with, "in the cot by the side of the sea," just like Annabel Lee ends with that kind of same rhythm. And it was the same subject matter, the same rhythm to the poem. Everything about it was the same. And it was incredible how close it sounded to the poem Annabel Lee, that almost it was impossible not to believe that somehow Poe had seen this poem, used it to write the poem Annabel Lee. So I spent the day kind of reading about that, and you have to read my book to kind of get the full story, but it looks like Poe probably did read that newspaper from 1807, even though it was written in 2 years before he was born. When he was here in Charleston, he most likely read that newspaper, saw that poem, and either stuck it in a corner of his mind or jotted it down when he read it, because there's a bit of a connection from the poem to his parents that you can read about in my book, and that's where it came from. But that story stuck in my mind for another 8 years until finally when the Poe idea came up, I thought I can kind of frame the story about Poe and Charleston around that poem and Annabel Lee, because there's been a legend about Annabel Lee being from Charleston for a long time, for more than 50 years, and that she's buried in a graveyard somewhere in downtown Charleston. And I spent a great deal of portion of the book searching for that grave, talking about the inspiration for Annabel Lee and whether that poem really inspired it, and all the things about Charleston that inspired Edgar Allan Poe, about the gold bug, to write the gold bug short story, to write his poetry. There's 3 short stories where he mentions Charleston: the gold bug, the oblong box, and the balloon hoax. So it seemed like a really good topic, and I think people have really enjoyed making that connection to Charleston. He only spent 13 months here in Charleston. And to be honest, he tried to hide that fact most of his life. There's very little evidence. He came to Charleston as a soldier in the artillery in 1827 and spent his 13 months here in Charleston. He tried to hide that fact for most of his life, and it wasn't until almost 35 years later that someone finally put together that Edgar Allan Poe had actually been in the Army here in Charleston, serving under the false name Edgar A. Perry. So very thin on details about what he did while he was in Charleston, but if you dig deep enough, you can see the impact that Charleston and the Low Country had on his writing later on, not just the gold bug and Annabel Lee, but different things too. So it seemed like a fun subject, and that's how we end up with Edgar Allan Poe's Charleston. And so now I'm working on a book called A History Lover's Guide to Charleston, which is going to be kind of almost like a guidebook for history fanatics who come to Charleston, or if you live here in Charleston. And basically I've got about 150 sites with maps, mostly in downtown Charleston, but also in surrounding areas like the plantations and things like that people can use and learn a little bit of history about each one. So each one's got about 300 words of description about the history of it. So if you're a history lover coming to Charleston, you can get the book and kind of find your way around town and learn some new things. So that's what I'm working on today. So kind of a weird way to get into writing, but that's the way that I got here. So, and as far as my writing style, I don't know. I wouldn't recommend my writing style to anyone. I'm a bit of a walker, which, as I learned studying Poe was a big walker too. He would take really long walks and think. And I'm a walker as well as a cyclist, so I like to take long bike rides. I like to take long walks. And during that time, in my mind, I begin to formulate the wording and the way I want words to flow and the subject matter and the chapters. And then after lots of walks or lots of bike rides, I'll just go and I sit down, and I'm very much someone who edits as they write. I don't write and then go back and edit. I'll write a sentence 10 times till I get it right. And obviously I will go back and proofread at the end, but I know lots of people just kind of get out what they want to say and then they go back and they chop it up and do, but I'm very much more a sentence by sentence person. I write a sentence, I change it, I change it, I change it again until I get what I want. But most of it's formulated in my mind on those long walks or on a bike ride that gives me the energy to finally go and sit down. And then, I'll sit down and get out 2,000 words in a weekend or something like that. So that's kind of been my writing style. But I don't know that I would recommend that for other people to do in their writing, but everyone's got their own style, and I'm definitely a procrastinator. I remember being in college and waiting, of course, till the night before to write term papers and things like that, and it's absolutely no different. Even now that I'm 47 years old, I still have the same attitude. I'm very much a procrastinator, but I do find that when I'm under the gun and pushed to deadlines, that I become more creative, and I feel like my writing actually, at some levels, is better because of that. So that's kind of my writing style, and I don't know. I mean, maybe I thought I would just like read a little bit out of my Edgar Allan Poe's Charleston, just to kind of give you an idea. When I write history, I remember years ago I was working at Petersburg National Battlefield, which is a Civil War park in Petersburg, Virginia, and I would work during the summers there in college. And the last almost year of the Civil War was fought there. Robert E. Lee versus Ulysses S. Grant, siege warfare was a standoff, lots of history. A really cool place. And so I was actually more on the maintenance side. I was like cutting the grass and doing all those kind of things. But there was a group of guys that were really hardcore historians that they would come out and they would take horses and they would do these exhibits of shooting cannons and all this stuff. And they lived together in this house on the park. And they were really hardcore historians. And we would hang out together because they knew I loved history, even though I was in maintenance. That I was a big history fan, and that I would go and watch movies with them, for example, or like Glory, the movie Glory with Matthew Broderick, set here in Charleston, part of it. And we would watch it, and like I would get so wrapped up in like the emotion and like the personalities of the story. But for them, it was always at the end, it would be like, that guy's button was on the wrong side, or like he was wearing the patch of the 5th Massachusetts, not the 4th Massachusetts, or whatever it was. They were very much detail-oriented in history, and I just was never that way. So when I got to writing history, I wanted to write it as a conversation and write it about people and those people's lives and the way they saw things maybe versus the way we see them today, and not get so much lost in the muck and mire of the details of the specifics of this happened on this day and this is exactly the events that occurred. So sometimes it makes me have to give a little bit of historical liberties sometimes, and sometimes I write as I think it may have happened, but I think in the end it makes it better for the reader, and it makes my writing accessible to people that maybe aren't necessarily hardcore historians, or maybe just have like a little mild interest in whatever the subject matter is versus being like a real like history nerd. So this is just a little section I wrote about an author from Charleston by the name of William Gilmore Simms. Now, William Gilmore Simms is kind of one of our forgotten literary heroes. William Gilmore Simms was born here in Charleston. He was a very prolific writer of both prose and poetry, as well as editing magazines and newspapers. He was almost manic when it came to writing. It was said that he would like stay up for days just writing and writing and writing, and sometimes his grammar was poor and misspellings and things like that, but he just was producing such a huge volume of things to write. And he was one of the very few authors in the mid-19th century that was literally making a living as an author. Edgar Allan Poe never really made a living as a writer. He was making a living as an editor. That said that The Raven, for example, earned Poe in his lifetime between $6 and $9 total. So he wasn't making a whole lot of money as an author. But William Gilmore Simms was making $6,000 a year after his first 2 novels were written. So he was one of the very few people in America at that time that was making a living as a writer, which was very difficult. Copyright laws were very weak. People could steal your writings and publish them without your permission and without giving you any kind of commission or royalty. So this is about William Gilmore Simms, who has a monument down at the Battery in downtown Charleston, and people kind of forgotten him, and a lot of that is his fault, actually. He was a great writer. He was actually a unionist. He served in the legislature in South Carolina as a unionist. He was very opposed to secession up until right before the Civil War. And then his first wife had passed. He remarried a wealthy woman who had a large plantation with slaves. He kind of became a gentleman planter versus an author living within Charleston itself. He moved out to a large plantation near Orangeburg, and his views began to change, and he became very much a secessionist and very pro-slavery. And the fact that he was pro-slavery was the reason that we don't remember him today. As a matter of fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe, her Uncle Tom's Cabin, obviously, which was very inspirational for abolitionists and certainly one of the foundations of the Civil War. There were books called anti-Tom books, which were written by Southerners that were in retaliation or opposition to Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom Cabin. And one of the most famous ones written was, in fact, by William Gilmore Simms. And he had written a story about a relationship between a slave and his owner and how slavery was right and was a natural condition to be in, and it was beneficial to the slave. So after the Civil War was over, he kind of ended up certainly on the losing end, and his writing kind of got lost in the wash afterwards. But he was a very prolific writer, and as I'll read here, Poe was a big fan. So this is just the beginning of a chapter that I call The South Will Write Again. I have been known to give unsolicited history lectures to tourists in downtown Charleston. It is admittedly a little obnoxious, and it tends to embarrass my wife if she happens to be with me when one of my orations start, but I cannot help myself. Most often these impromptu history lessons occur when I'm walking through White Point Garden and I see a group, perhaps a family, reading the pirate monument located in the northeast corner of the park. If the observer gives a lingering, sincere read of the monument and not just a passing scan, I make my move. Before the sightseer knows what has hit them, they have learned more about the early 18th century Charleston piracy than they certainly ever planned. But sadly, more often than not, my lectures seem to go unappreciated and conclude not with some piratically inclined follow-up questions, but with the most frequently asked question in downtown Charleston: do you know where there's a public restroom? It seems everyone is looking for a restroom. Very disappointing. But I hope that at least Stede Bonnett and the dozens of other pirates hanged and buried 3 centuries ago at White Point Garden are grateful for my efforts to share their history. There is another monument in White Point Garden only 100 feet or so away from the pirate monument. And while this one is much larger and more centrally located in the park, it is woefully underappreciated by locals and tourists alike. Dedicated on June 11, 1879, the monument honors Charleston's author, William Gilmore Simms. While I was still in the research stages of this book, I wanted to see if anyone visiting the park was familiar with or maybe even a fan of William Gilmore Simms. So one summer evening during a bike ride, I made a stop at Simms Monument and started doing some people watching. Sitting on a bench opposite the Simms Monument and not seeing much activity, it was not long before I started to get restless and had to restrain myself from engaging those who I could see nearby perusing the pirate monument. Bored and antsy from the uneventfulness, I kept reminding myself of the focus of my experiment, which was to observe people's interaction with the Simms Monument, not talk pirates. Nearly everyone who passed by did not give Simms Monument so much as a glance. A slight change in trajectory along the path to the left or right to skirt past his monument was the only indication of most people's awareness of the large stone structure. A small group that did stop at the monument to read its inscription seemed to do so more as the duty-bound action of a responsible tourist and not because of any genuine collective interest in learning about the man the monument honored. I approached this group of dutiful visitors, including one especially responsible sightseer taking pictures of the monument, and asked, "Do you know William Gilmore Simms?" The responses from the group were unanimously no. Eyes glazed over in boredom as I listed Simms' facts, dates, and writings. But then when I asked, "Do you know Edgar Allan Poe?" their eyes brightened and re-engaged. "I love Edgar Allan Poe. Did he know this guy?" asked one woman, pointing to the monument. "Well, Poe said that William Gilmore Simms was the best writer in America," I explained, and he said Simms wrote the best ghost story that he had ever read. It was like magic. With the Poe connection, I could see a renewed, sincere interest wash over the group as they gave the monument a thorough look. As I walked away, I saw smiles conjured up and guts sucked in while the group positioned for a photo in front of the monument. I was pretty pleased with myself, perhaps more satisfying, no one asked me where they could find a public restroom. Poe's exact words, written in 1845 while editor of the New York Broadway Journal, were that Simms was immeasurably the best writer of fiction in America and the best novelist which this country has, upon the whole, produced. And Poe's comments on Simms' ghost story titled Myrtle Will Out, which was the first tale in a collection called The Wigwam in the Cabin, was no less impressive. We have no hesitation in calling it the best ghost story we have ever read. Truly praise from Caesar. So that's a little bit about me and my books, how I got into writing, and I hope that maybe it'll spark interest and you'll want to read a little bit more about pirates and Poe, and hopefully when the next book comes along, you'll want to check that one out too. If you'd like to read any of my books, you can find them at the public library, and then you can also visit me at my website. That's Captain Birds, birds with a Y, so CaptainByrds.com. And you can buy my books on my website, and you'll also learn more about me and my writing. I thank you for your time, and thank you.